Alright guys, today we're talking about Chapter 10, Memory Disorders. Just before we get into anything, I want to remind you again that you do have a quiz due today at 7:10 p.m. You'll have 15 minutes to complete it, and this PowerPoint and videos that are embedded in it are essential for, well, I think for success on that quiz. So make sure that you actually take the time to listen to this lecture as well as watch the videos, and that will help you on your quiz. Please also do not forget that you have concept cards due for Chapter 10 next Tuesday. So please get those finished as well so that you will be prepared with those. Then we'll see you guys next Tuesday, and we'll get back into our content. So for today, let's just focus on Chapter 10. So today we're talking about different types of memory disorders. Now, your book spends a good amount of time focusing on amnesias and different forms of amnesia, so that's where we're going to start today as well. So the first thing I want to do is just start by talking about the methodology that goes into studying amnesia. Now, this is an extremely difficult area to kind of get a good understanding of, because if you think about it, we don't have experimental control with amnesia patients. We can't just assign someone to say, all right, today you have this type of amnesia and tomorrow you'll have a different one. Instead, we have to collect people who are available and willing to participate in studies. So this being said, it means that researchers have to deal with a very small sample size, which makes it difficult to find people who are interested in participating in studies, as well as more difficulty drawing conclusions based on these small sample sizes. So that can pose a unique issue for research on psychological disorders. Another difficulty that we see with studying amnesia is that there are a lot of individual differences in symptomology. So when we think about this means that patients who have amnesia are not all the same. Just because one person is presenting with X symptoms doesn't mean that the next person is going to have the similar symptoms. They may have some overlap, and they may both come with the same diagnosis, but it doesn't mean that they're going to experience everything exactly the same. Now, some patients might have difficulty learning new information, and some people might not be able to remember their past. There are going to be differences in that. And then we might see benefits for different strategies for one group of people, where another group of people don't get any help from that type of treatment. So it means that researchers have to really investigate all potential avenues when it comes to studying amnestic patients. And with this, like I was alluding to before, a lot of the research has to do with case studies instead of experimental research. We can't ethically randomly assign brain damage. It just doesn't work like that, not with human patients. So since we're unable to experimentally induce memory deficits, that means we cannot determine a cause and effect for memory deficits in amnestic patients. So think back to the start of this semester when we were talking about the difference between correlation and causation. Experiment and experimental designs, that's how we determine causation. Since we don't have that ability with amnestic research, we're not able to determine that this is what causes this. Instead, we're just making judgments based on correlations and what we might suspect could be an influential factor. Another way that we get at some of these potential cause and effects is by using comparative research, and we've discussed comparative research before in this class. That's where we experiment with animals and then can extrapolate from the data. So think back to Carl Lashley's Engram study. He was using ablations with mice and rats to figure out areas of the brain that could cause memory damage. We can do the same thing today, where we can see, okay, if this area of the brain is damaged, does a mouse have certain types of amnestic characteristics? So these are different things that can pose a challenge when it comes to studying amnestic patients. So today we're going to talk through a variety of different types of memory disorders. The first one I want to do is talk about psychogenic amnesia. So starting with psychogenic amnesia, this has also been referred to as fugue or dissociative fugue state. This is a special case of amnesia where the memory deficits are not a result of brain injury or disease. So we've talked about retrograde and anterograde amnesia in this class before. Those we see a biological cause. With psychogenic amnesia, there is no biological cause that we can identify at this time. It's thought to result from some psychological trauma, which is why we call it psychogenic amnesia. And what happens when a person experiences this is that they all of a sudden lose this sense of personal identity, and they often don't know who they are, who their family is, where they're from, so they get lost a lot of times and have a hard time figuring out where they're supposed to be. Other symptoms that are included in this is that this person has lost all of their autobiographical memories, all those core memories that mean something to an individual and make them who they are. Since they can't remember this, it makes it hard for them to remember who they are, where they're supposed to be, all of these different things. We don't really see a loss of semantic memory that's just general knowledge and facts, so not those knowledge for yourself, but general knowledge, or implicit memory. Those seem to remain intact. Mostly what the deficits come with are the loss of this personal connection. So what researchers think might cause psychogenic amnesia is that it's really triggered by some intense stress. So something severe is going on. This kind of shows that this fugue state can be seen as a flight response. So we're trying to avoid this stressful situation entirely and just get out of kind of our own body in a sense. Now, people who experience fugue sometimes have experienced brain trauma in some sort in the past, but it doesn't appear that it's caused by a specific trauma. It's not like these individuals are getting hit in the head and then all of a sudden experience this. It is just this something that seems to be brought on by a stressful stimulus. Now, the thing to know about this is that these states aren't forever. They tend to clear up within a few days, and there are few examples of people who have extended fugue states where they're experiencing it for a longer period of time. Jeff Ingram is actually somebody who recently experienced a fugue state and needed to figure out where he was. He was in Colorado and he was just walking down the street, and one day didn't remember why he was walking down the street, what his name was. He appeared on the news under the name Al, asking for somebody to recognize him. So this really does happen. This link right here is a video to Jeff's story, and so I highly recommend that you watch that video to better understand this psychogenetic amnesia. So the duration isn't very long, and this tends to be ended by some very strong retrieval cue. So it could be seeing a family member or something that has that strong sense of retrieval, something very connected. It's not typically that you just snap out of it, but it's that they have this retrieval cue and it comes back. Now, interestingly enough, people don't tend to remember the things that occurred while in that fugue state. So it's not that people are just forgetting all of a sudden and then everything comes back again. This fugue state kind of is this period of amnesia where they don't remember what happened during that time either. So just to kind of wrap that up, psychogenic amnesia comes from stress. It seems to come from stress. It doesn't have that biological component that we associate with other types of amnesias. With it, we see autobiographical memory be extremely poor, so we have a hard time remembering information about ourselves, but implicit and aspects of semantic memory are intact. They're not going away. This is an extremely rare case of amnesia, so less than 1% of psychiatric patients experience this, and it doesn't last long, and it is relieved by this strong retrieval cue. That's what helps us come back, and this state clears up in a few days. However, we still don't have any memory of what occurred during that fugue state. So that's a little bit about psychogenic amnesia. Remember, that's the type of amnesia that doesn't have a biological or organic cause. Other types of amnesia that do have these organic causes are things that we've talked about in this class before. So let's start with talking about anterograde amnesia. This is where we have a hard time forming new memories after we experience an injury or disease. So anterograde, we can't create new memories after the time of this injury. We can do experimental research with this. Some patients can be given a list of 15 words and then not remember a single word no matter how many times the same list is presented to them. It's even just immediate recall. They have a hard time doing that because they're not encoding these new memories. So your book talks about a few classic cases of anterograde amnesia, the case of HM, as well as Clive Wearing. We've talked about Clive Wearing in this class. We watched that video at the start of the semester. That's a great example of anterograde amnesia, where we can't form these new memories. Clive Wearing had that 7-second memory where within just a few seconds he had forgotten what they were just talking about. So that's the presenting symptoms of anterograde amnesia. In terms of things that cause anterograde amnesia, we tend to see damage to specific areas be primary causes. Specifically, it tends to be damage to the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobe, and potentially mammillary bodies as well. So these are areas of the brain that are extremely important for learning and memory. So if these areas are damaged, it makes it hard for us to learn and remember new information. We've talked in this class the importance of the hippocampus. If the hippocampus is damaged, that's where we see these clear deficits and potential amnesias. A lot of times we can assess the damage to these areas by having the patient attempt to learn new information. If they're unable to do that, we oftentimes conclude that it's likely damage to a certain area and anterograde amnesia. We can also use different types of assessment tools. One common tool is the Wechsler Memory Scale. This is the most common assessment tool, and here we use paired associate learning. There's some story memory, visual memory, digit spans, reproducing drawings, and much more to get at different features that could indicate anterograde amnesia. So this image here on this screen is an example of something that a patient might see. I'd show you this image on the left, and then that image would disappear, and I'd show you the image on the right, and I'd ask you to identify which of those images you had previously seen. Now for you that might be easy. These images are kind of distinct. They don't really seem to overlap with each other. Someone with anterograde amnesia would have a very hard time identifying this. We could also do things like story, where I tell you a short story and then ask you questions about this. When I say a short story, I mean the story takes less than 45 seconds to say, and then questions are asked immediately, and people tend to have a harder time with that. We've talked about digit spans in this class before as well. So a lot of these are all built into the Wechsler Memory Scale for us to determine what a typical functioning memory looks like compared to something that might indicate amnesia. Another type of assessment tool that is sometimes used is the River-Mead Behavioral Memory Test. What this does is it evaluates our capacity to learn new information, and it's new information that's related to our everyday life. So a lot of the tests are similar to that Wechsler memory scale, where we can have some recognition tests, immediate and delay recall, for taking a route. So how can you get to a certain location? Remembering a message, if I give you a message, or remembering a grocery list, or faces and perspective memory. Like we've talked about in this class, all of these things have a clear impact on our daily lives. If an individual is unable to do that, it might mean that they can't function on their own independently. So it's important for us to use this test to determine whether an individual is experiencing these amnestic qualities and then can continue to live independently. Typically, when we see anterograde amnesia, we also are observing something that we refer to as amnestic syndrome. So amnestic syndrome, it's called this because we typically see patients suffering from a common set of problems while other areas of memory are intact. Mostly it's identified by specific impairment of encoding of new information in both the episodic and semantic memory. So we're impaired in our ability to encode and remember this new information, both in our episodic memories as well as our semantic memories. However, at this same time, we still see areas of our cognitive abilities remain intact. So we still have an intact working memory system. We can manipulate information in our minds. Language and intelligence seem relatively unaffected, and implicit memory still seems to function all right. But we do see damage in certain areas, like we were just discussing, like the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobe, and then sometimes with those mammillary bodies. And that's what's causing these deficits in memory and learning. So what we're seeing with anterograde amnesia is an example of this amnestic syndrome. So here I have an embedded video. I recommend you just pause this lecture and watch the video really quick to kind of help you understand anterograde amnesia. I think it's kind of tricky remembering the difference between all of these different types of amnesias, so I try and embed as many videos as possible. I do it for a reason, so I think you all should watch them. Something else that we sometimes see occur with amnesia is anosognosia. This is where an individual does not recognize that they're experiencing cognitive deficits. So they believe that they are still functioning as normal. So it's typically seen in an extreme case of amnesia or a really dense case of amnesia. So think about if you've seen the movie 50 First Dates. That's somebody who's not aware that they have this cognitive deficit. They don't understand that they have amnesia. Most movies or media that you see about amnesia tend to play up this feature. It can really provide an additional burden for caregiving. For people who have to take care of this individual and constantly manage the symptoms that are occurring while also knowing that this individual does not understand that they have a cognitive deficit. So this can be extremely hard for caregivers. So that's about anterograde amnesia. Now I want to talk more about retrograde amnesia. So we've discussed this before in this class. Retrograde amnesia is where we see impairments in recalling previous information before injury or illness. So I like these images. It was on the anterograde amnesia as well. Now you can see this is where the time of now, and we can't remember our old memories. Anterograde is we can't remember the new memories. So just keep that in mind. Retrograde cannot remember the old memories. Now, there's a feature related to retrograde amnesia that's referred to as Ribot's Law. What this is getting at is how newer memories tend to be more affected by retrograde amnesia compared to older memories. In other words, things that happen really close to the point of brain damage are more likely to be affected compared to things that happened long ago. So if an individual experiences brain trauma at the age of 26, they're not likely to remember things that happened leading up to this injury, but they might recall things that happened when they were a child. So this is something where a lot of those memories that are closer to the accidents are lost, but previous information may still be retained. However, in some cases, people with retrograde amnesia don't see such a clear pattern, so we are not seeing this with every single individual. This has also led to research on consolidation, where we're transferring memory into our long-term memory, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Another case of this that relates to retrograde amnesia is this post-traumatic amnesia. It's a special case of short-lived amnesia that occurs just after we return to consciousness after an injury or potentially severe illness. It does have some retrograde qualities where we're missing information from around the time where we experienced an accident, as well as some anterograde amnesia as well, where we have poor memory for what's going on after the accident. So a lot of times you see this in movies as well, where people can't remember what happened to them just before they were in a car accident, and then just after, their memory is still pretty hazy as well. And what this is getting at is this lack of consolidation or lack of encoding. So we're not fully consolidating those memories because we've experienced this trauma that has impaired our ability to encode that information into our long term. Now, something that we can also use the duration of post-traumatic amnesia to really determine the severity of a head injury. So if someone is having this or experiencing these amnestic qualities for an extended period of time, we can determine that that's a pretty severe head injury. So a lot of times we might see this with sports injuries where looking at how long a player might be concussed and how long their symptoms are lasting, that can tell us how bad of an injury they actually experienced. Now, when we test these features of retrograde amnesia, it's usually tested by examining recall in 3 different areas. First, we look at autobiographical information. So we want to see if people are remembering information about themselves. Now, a lot of times we do this with the cue word technique. So like we discussed in class this week, it's where an individual is given a word and then asked to generate memories that come to mind when they see that word. So if they see the word key, what memory comes to mind when they see the word key? We might also use lexical and semantic information to test their different types of amnesias. So just having individuals distinguish between things that occur naturally versus man-made. That's getting at this semantic information. Do you know the difference between these two things? A tree is natural, a chair is man-made. And then finally, we might just test their general semantic memory. So asking them if they know important dates, if they recognize famous people, or the prices of common objects. So these are all things that we might use to get at retrograde amnesia. Now, for a good example of retrograde amnesia, you can click on this video. It's kind of a traumatic video. It was done about a family, and they're on the doctor's show. But it still shows retrograde amnesia nonetheless. So definitely look at that. Now, when we think about amnesia, sometimes the term pure amnesia is used for people who are only experiencing deficits in memory. They're not experiencing any changes or impairments in their intellect or personality. The only thing that's happening is they cannot remember things anymore. We can see other cognitive areas preserved as well, one being implicit memory, where participants are still responding to priming tasks, word completion tasks. They can still remember a lot of those implicit memories and procedural memories, so that seems to remain intact pretty well. Working memory is another facet that's preserved, so they're still able to manipulate information and experience some deficits where their digit span scores are decreasing compared to before the accident. However, we see working memory remain largely intact. Finally, lexical and semantic memory do seem to be spared. People can still understand the meaning of words, use language correctly. There are some disorders where semantic memory is lost and episodic memory is retained. But for the most case, in amnesia, we see semantic memory remain intact. So what leads to amnesia? What are some of these theoretical explanations that help us understand what's happening here? One hypothesis has to do with consolidation. So thinking about amnesia, it's possible that this process is preventing us from consolidating our memories. So we need to process information and transfer it from our working to long-term memory. If we're experiencing a trauma or head trauma, that might mean that we don't transfer the information to long-term memory. So for example, with retrograde amnesia, this is really consistent with Ribot's law, where the less consolidated memories are ones that are more likely to be forgotten. So things that happened just leading up to the accident, we didn't have as much time to process and move that information to our long-term memory and rehearse it in our long-term memory compared to our very old memories. For anterograde amnesia, it would still explain why new memories are not easily stored. Now the consolidation process has just kind of been wrecked, and it's hard for us to consolidate those memories, which means that we're not encoding this new information. So that's our main theoretical explanation for what's going on with amnesia. The next memory disorder that I'm going to briefly touch on in today's lecture is dementia. We'll come back to dementia later in the semester, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but your textbook does talk a lot about it, so make sure you are familiar with that. Now, dementia is a term that we use where we see deterioration of intellectual functionings that are severe enough to interfere with our social and occupational functionings. So this is something that's occurring that is having a significant impact on our day-to-day living. It's not just forgetting something every once in a while. It is now hindering how we go about our daily lives. Now, when we think about dementia, the one that most people commonly think about is Alzheimer's disease. However, this is just one type of dementia. There are many other forms. We experience vascular dementias, Lewy bodies, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, Korsakoff's, and frontotemporal or Pick's disease. So there are a variety of styles of dementia and forms of dementia out there. So it's important to keep in mind that Alzheimer's is just one. Now, as I mentioned, we'll come back to talking about Alzheimer's once we get to chapter 12. But what I want to do now is talk about a different form of dementia. Something that has been discussed a lot more recently is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or otherwise known as CTE. This is a dementia that results from repeated head trauma. So things like experiencing repeated concussions of blows that are non-consecutive. So when thinking about boxing, it's not just the number of times that you've been knocked unconscious, but it's more related to the number of rounds that you've boxed. So the more times that you are boxing in the ring, that's more likely to lead to CTE compared to just the number of times you've been knocked out. However, it is important to note that not everyone with a history of head trauma and concussions goes on to develop CTE. There's a push for a lot of research right now to understand why certain individuals are getting CTE. However, no one gets CTE without a history of head trauma, so this dementia is largely preventable. If you're not getting head traumas, you're not going to develop CTE. A lot of the major symptoms include memory impairment, confusion. We do see personality changes where people might have been mild-mannered before become extremely aggressive, or the opposite direction. There are attentional difficulties, planning problems. They have erratic behavior, including aggression, as well as depression and suicidal thoughts. Now, some current understandings that we have for the causes and treatment of CTE. The causes right now, we can say that head trauma and head injury is definitely a leading factor for this. What we're seeing is that with CTE, there is a buildup of tau tangles, or more presence of tau tangles. We tend to see tau tangles also present in disorders like Alzheimer's disease. So this is suggesting that there's something going on with tau. Currently, in terms of treatment, we follow the Alzheimer's disease protocol. This isn't really ideal because they are two separate disorders, but that's all we've got right now. And we're trying to understand more. There's lots of research being funded by the Alzheimer's Association, the NIH, or the National Institute of Health, as well as the NFL, or the National Football League, because these are organizations that are really pushing for an understanding of what's happening. We want to better understand why some people are developing CTEs but not others, and how we can prevent them from occurring. Now, this is a very quick, brief overview about CTEs and the current research out there. So again, I recommend you take a look at this. And if you want to know more, there are other videos out there that I have connected here that can talk about other types of consequences from concussions and head trauma and things like that. So that is all I have for today's lecture. Please do not forget to submit that quiz before 7:10 p.m. tonight. Make sure you're getting your concept cards done, and then I will see you next Tuesday. All right, see you guys.